debate. May I remind you to switch off your mobile phones. Thank you. The motion for this round today is this House set quotas on energy consumption on every household. Debating this round are Team USA Red, who are proposing, as well as Team Heidehof, who are opposing. Speaking for the proposition are our first speaker Nikki, second speaker Nicholas, and third speaker Mila. Please welcome them. Speaking for the opposition are first speaker Julia, second speaker Björn, and third speaker Julia. Please welcome them. Judging this debate are Lena Leiva from Peru. I don't know if it's right, but
Gina, but it's okay.
Emma Lucas from the Netherlands, and Juditha from the Czech Republic. Please welcome her. Speaking time for the speeches are 8 minutes. The first and the last minutes are protected from points of information. A knock or ring will be sounded after the first and the 7th minute. There are no points of information during the reply speeches. It's now my pleasure to welcome Nikki, the first speaker of the proposition, to open the debate.
Governments exist to serve the needs of their people. They are the one institution that is designed to look out for the welfare of an entire country, and to do the things that no private company or private citizen would do on their own. We believe that every time a road is broken or a bridge collapses, the government has failed to do its job. But in much the same way, we believe that every time a citizen must wear a mask on their face to walk on the streets, the government has also failed. Because we on Team Proposition believe that clean air and water are just as important as roads and bridges, it is an honor to propose today's motion. In this speech, I'll be doing 3 different things. I'll begin by clarifying the round and proposing a burden and a model, move on to present our first argument, that the government is justified in using quotas for this goal, and finally end with the second argument on Team Proposition, which is that this would be effective in protecting the citizens. But let's begin by providing some framing for this round. To begin with, we offer the following burden for this round: that if Team Proposition can show that this motion is within line with other governmental actions in order to serve the citizens, that Team Proposition should win this round. In order to meet this burden, we propose the following model: that the government would set a variable cap on consumption based on factors such as household size in order to reduce greenhouse emissions, enforced in a similar manner to tax law. But with that in mind, let's move on to the first substantive argument on Team Proposition, which is that this motion is justified in order to serve the citizens. Governments take all forms of actions in order to provide for the public good. Now, the public good is a different class of goods, simply put, because no one will take care of it on their own. Their overall issue is that only a government can handle because they won't happen naturally on their own. Take, for example, roads or bridges. Everybody needs them, everybody wants them, but only rarely does somebody want them enough to build it themselves. If the government doesn't tax the people and then step in to build that vital infrastructure, no one will have them and the public will be harmed. Governments are set up to provide for exactly these sorts of things. Articles that benefit the entire public, but that require a government to protect them. Yes?
Could you prove why the amount of energy consumption that you reduce will prevent bridges from collapsing?
I'll be discussing efficacy in my second point, and I'm not talking about bridges collapsing, I'm talking about clean air and clean water. But let's move on to talk about what governments are justified in doing in order to serve this notion of the public good. Governments take various different actions, but the most intuitive one is the simple example of taxes. Governments take income from the people in order to provide for the public good. At first face, this might seem like an unjust thing for governments to do, but because they are providing a valuable service to the rest of the people, it's well within line of what governments are supposed to do. They couldn't provide you with roads or bridges without taxes, and so they are justified in taxing. But governments also do different things in order to protect the people. Governments have the power to regulate things and to make things illegal. For instance, to protect the environment, governments often outlaw certain forms of pollution, both by large companies and by private individuals, because they understand that pollution will only harm the overall public. We on Team Proposition believe that a quota is a less extreme form of both of these things. In a quota, the government is neither taking anything from the people or even making anything explicitly illegal, simply setting an upper limit on how much of an action a government can perform. Quotas are well within the bounds of what a government is justified to do to serve the people. And in the past, governments have instituted quotas for a number of different reasons. In World War I and World War II, the British government set quotas and rations on nearly everything that households consumed, right down to what they ate. Now, environmental crises may not be as severe as wars, but neither is this quota nearly as severe as the quota implemented by the British and American governments in the World Wars. The environment is a valuable public good, and quotas are well within the realm of what governments are justified to do to protect the people. So what we believe that we have shown you through analysis and through past examples is that a quota is a perfectly justified action for a government to take within this round. But now let's ask ourselves, why exactly is this action effective? And this brings me to my second point, which is that setting quotas would be effective in protecting the people from the dangers of emissions. In this world, whenever you have demand for energy, you're always going to have a corresponding demand for emissions. Even though there are forms of green energy, there is simply not enough infrastructure to produce clean energy for the entire world's energy consumption needs to be met without producing emissions. Take, for example, this country, which is legendary for its commitment to green energy and is consistently ranked in the top 15 in the world. Even in Germany, only 13% of energy comes from completely renewable resources. So, even in the best case scenario, so long as you have a high demand for energy, you are going to have a high level of emissions in order to meet that. But what exactly happens when you have a high level of emissions? It's not enough to simply blame emissions on large corporations, because households are a major source of demand for energy, and even in places where there is not much energy, not much industry, we still see high demand for energy and high levels of emissions. Take, for example, Russia, a country where well under 40% of the gross domestic product is due to industry. It's not a heavily industrialized nation, and yet they still struggle with problems of high energy demand and high emissions. In Moscow, which is not the teeming hub of factories of Shanghai, they still have massive problems with air pollution, and you see images of people forced to wear masks simply to walk in the streets, because the air has been polluted from power plants, not powering large factories, but powering the homes of the Russian people. We believe that so long as there is such a high demand from private citizens for energy, they will always suffer the consequences of equally high emissions. If you reduce the demand for those emissions, though, if you set a quota on household uses of energy, then you can correspondingly lower the rates of emissions and reduce those harms. Take, for example, the Kyoto Protocol, in which the international community agreed to set quotas on consumptions of certain goods by private individuals. By lowering that demand, the Kyoto Protocol did more to reduce greenhouse emissions and environmental pollution than every other international agreement combined. Just by setting quotas, just by reducing demand, the Kyoto Protocol had a massive beneficial impact on emissions and on the environment and for the people of this entire world. You cannot end the problem of emissions without first ending the problem of consumption. But why is it so important to reduce emissions? Emissions have a number of different harmful effects, both on the short local level and on a more long-term global level. But let's start with the more immediate effects. The UN Council on the Environment recently released a report detailing what the short-term immediate impacts of increasing emissions are. They argue that within one country, the effects of these pollutions not only pose a direct health risk through things like increased cancer rate, respiratory illness, and asthma, but also made it harder to provide clean water and inexpensive food because of the level of general environmental pollution. At the point where the demand for energy is making it difficult for citizens to find clean water to drink and to afford the food they put on their table, something clearly needs to be done about this issue. But also in the long term, emissions prove a grave risk to this entire world. And I'll allow my second speaker, Nick, to elaborate more on those harms in the next speech. At the end of the day, we believe that providing clean water and clean air is just as important as building roads and bridges. And that's why it's such an honor to propose today's motion.
Thank you, Vicky, for your speech. Now I'd like to call Julia.
Can you wait 1 second?
Oh, sorry.
I'll let you know.
I'd now like to call Julia to give her speech.
Ladies and gentlemen, the big problem that we see with team propositions model today is that the things and this model that they presented us is only a delay of the problem that we face today, and it's only a delay of this climate change that we have, but it doesn't actually solve the problem that we have in this world of this ongoing climate change, and that's why they have to show us today which tangible benefits we have from delaying the problem and dealing with it because we have to deal with it in the future anyway, and because we cannot completely solve this problem, and why this tangible benefit that they have to mention is more important than the harms that we have already by imposing this quota. So we see that it's only a delay and therefore not sensible to impose this quota on the energy consumption for the households, and that we only have a little benefit. And we are going to talk about the harms that we have right now already today. No, thank you. And those are that saving the climate is an individual choice, and imposing this quota would be taking the freedom of the individual. And secondly, no, thank you, that it is a disadvantage for the poor to have such a quota, and then the second speaker is going to talk about why imposing such a quota would stop innovations in the long term. So to come to the rebuttal of what the first speaker has said, well, he first talked about the justification of their model, and then secondly talked about the effectiveness in protecting the citizens. Well, to the first point, the justification, he talked a lot about the environmental things like not having clean water or clear air, and that all these things are things that the government has to provide for its citizens. But we see that these examples of clean water, clean air, they don't really fit to the developed countries that we have. Like when we look at when we look at developed countries like the USA or Germany, for example, we don't really have that problem of not having clean air or clean water provided for the citizens. And no, thank you. And that's why we see that this problem actually is more. These problems are more likely for countries which are less developed and therefore not really actually fit into this motion. And we also see to the second thing, the effectiveness in protecting the citizens, that in the short term, we see that a quota like this would also promote people to buy things that are more energy efficient, and that this is actually even bad for the environment, because that means more consumption, and it means buying new things, which is actually bad for the environment, and therefore has has a bad impact in the short term. And we also think that imposing this is the wrong way to actually change the thinking of the people, because people will not change their thinking, but could also turn against this whole green thinking by imposing them and forcing them to do that. And now to come to my own first point, that saving the climate is an individual choice. Well, we see that it is not justified to impose such a quota, because it is the goal of the state is that they want to that the goal that the state wants to achieve, that saving the climate, is a very theoretical one that is far away from the people. And no, thank you. And that actually in democratic state, the state is there to serve the people's will and to be there for the people. And it is a very individual choice, and a choice of prioritizing whether you think that saving the climate is important or not. Don't you agree, sir?
Since when has it been your human right to run the AC for 24 hours a day?
Well, we still see that it is very individual whether you think that saving the climate is important or not. You could also say, well, I don't care what, I don't care if I should use less energy or not, because I just want to live my lifestyle that I have. I want to drive a big car. I want to use all my electronic devices. What is so bad about the thinking of what is so bad about the thinking of these people? Everyone has the individual choice to say and to have this individual freedom to say whether you think it's important or not. And we see that that we take the individual freedom here of the people, and that taking this individual freedom is also harming the self-actualization of the people, which is a bad impact on every single person. And we also see don't see why countries have saving the climate here is also for saving countries like maybe the Seychelles or or the Netherlands, because the level of water rises, and we don't really see why every single country has a responsibility for other countries, and for because we see that that these countries actually are the ones who are affected by this climate change. No, thank you. And to come to the second point, the whole discrimination, the discrimination of the people who are not as privileged as others, because who are the people who can actually afford buying green energy? Who are the people who can afford buying energy efficient products? Those are not the poor people. Those are the people who are rich and who have the money to think of the environment. And so we see that, or who are the people who vote for the Green Party? All these are people who are very rich and who have the time and the money to think of the environment. And by imposing this quota, we think that this means that we prioritize people who are rich, and that we have a huge disadvantage and discrimination of the people who cannot afford using less energy. Or and what will happen to those people who cannot, who don't have the money to buy an insulation for their house to need less energy, or to buy products like a fridge who uses less energy than the one they already have. We think that this is a huge discrimination of less privileged people, and that we cannot that we don't want to have this discrimination, and that this is the wrong way that we impose this for every single household, also to people who cannot afford that. So what have I told you today is that team propositions model only delays the problem of this climate change that we have, and they have to show us why the benefits that we have are more important than the harms we have right now, by taking the individual freedom of everyone to say whether they prioritize saving the climate, or whether they prioritize having the lifestyle they already have. And secondly, the second harm is that we also have disadvantages and the discrimination of the people who cannot afford this green energy, and who simply cannot afford this green thinking, because it's much more expensive than not doing this. And for all of these reasons, the motion must fall.
Thank you, Julia, for your speech.
I'm 8-6.
I'd now like to call Nicholas to give his speech.
We believe that every citizen has a vested interest to do something to help the environment. And we also believe that it is well within the authority, and in fact the duty, of the government to protect the very air and water that we breathe. We believe that clean air and water are just as important as roads and bridges, and thus we are so proud to propose this motion. So, first I'm going to deconstruct their side of this debate, and then I'm going to bolster our points. But before I do that, I'm going to tell you that they have neglected to refute our burden. Our burden, if you remember, is that we believe that we should win this debate if we prove that these quotas are consistent with other things governments do to serve their citizens. This has been completely uncontested. Therefore, we accept this as tacit complicity. Now, let's go on to their arguments. They say, this argument about the loss of freedom. We say that this is actually a very marginal loss of freedom. I asked the POI, since when is it your human right to run the AC for 24 hours a day? It is not, and they have no real substantive answer to this argument. In fact, the only thing they said, it is that it's your personal freedom to say, I don't care. What's so bad about not hurting the environment? We say that it is well within the government's power to restrict your freedom, especially in this case, because A, this freedom is completely inconsequential to the lives of the average citizen. We do not think that it really affects who you are, much less your self-actualization. Right? The thing that makes you feel like your entire humanity is based off of your ability to run the air conditioning for 24 hours a day. This right is not harmed by this quota. And so we think that this argument is completely bogus and not a substantive refutation to our point. In addition, we tell you that the government restricts far more important freedoms all the time. They say polluting is illegal. You can't litter. And because of this, this point stands on our side. The government can legitimately do it, and our burden has actually been fulfilled. Second thing they say is that we don't solve climate change. Instead, we delay it. We say, and we have a few answers to this. First, we say, our burden in this case is not to solve climate change 100%. And it's well within the role of the government to just take a first step in this. Yep?
Just because the government does it doesn't mean that it is right. So can you analyze why it would be right?
Well, okay, I've already done that. I've shown you that if a right is inconsequential and if the government is acting in the public good, then these two things make it possible for the government to restrict your freedom. And we think this happens all the time. Why is it legitimate for the government to pay taxes? Because it is providing a public good. And even at the risk of a far more consequential personal freedom, the freedom to property, the freedom to have your money. And so we think that in this far more inconsequential case, they have no real ground to stand on to say that it is illegitimate for the government to restrict the amount of energy they use. Our second refutation to this idea that we don't solve climate change, we delay it, is we say, don't let the great be the enemy of the good. Don't be forever chasing after a perfect policy that is going to keep you from implementing ones that are good, that are going to take steps towards solving the problem. Or else you'll end up in the world of the opposition, where they're actually doing nothing to help climate change. Now, let's go on to the third refutation, which is that they say that unclean air and water doesn't really happen in developed countries, only in underdeveloped ones. We've given you a few examples already. Let me give you more. In Russia, in Moscow, my first speaker told you about the face masks that people have to wear. In Utah and America, you can set your water on fire because of fracking deregulation. In China, you can't see 10 feet in front of you in some places because air pollution is so bad. We think that their case is actually not grounded in the reality of today's world. They also say that, getting people to buy sustainable technology is really bad. And we think that they didn't have enough analysis on this argument to prove it to you. And second, that actually sustainable technology is really good, which is, coincidentally, why you call it sustainable technology. Now, let's go on to their last argument, which is about discrimination. First of all, we say that our model is actually based on a progressive tax model. My first speaker told you our model says the punishment for not meeting your quota is completely progressive, which means that people who will not be able to afford an exorbitant tax will be taken account for. And so it's not really that discriminatory. And second, we say that quota, of course, is not going to be so exorbitantly low that even people won't be able to meet their basic energy needs. And so we think it's not a well-analyzed refutation to our side. Now, our first point is that this quota is in keeping with other policies to help the people. We say that it's a reasonable thing for government to do. It happens all the time. That everybody needs a good environment, but people don't have the power to create a sustainable environment just by themselves, so they need the government to help. We say that we've given you quite a few examples of how this happens in today's world. We've given you taxes, food rations. The government even implements water quotas, and many times, for example, in the cases of drought. In my home state, there's a water quota that people view as completely legitimate because we need to conserve water. We think the environment is exactly the same way. We need to conserve our environment. We need to keep our world safe. They haven't really had a substantive reputation to this. Let's move on to our second point. We've shown you that this will help the environment in very good ways. It'll protect the public. We say that reducing the demand for lots and lots of energy is going to reduce the supply. The power factors are not going to have to go into overdrive and pollute the environment. This is going to have great effects. Kofi Annan said that if we don't do this kind of policy within 5 years, then our world is going to be much better off. And those impacts that the first speaker mentioned, the impacts of having really expensive water, really expensive food, people who are struggling, not being able to get their basic needs, are going to be spread throughout the entire world. Now, let's go on to our third argument, which is that this policy will increase the mindfulness of the average citizen. We tell you that people need to be reminded all the time about their responsibility to their environment, that even their most mundane actions can have drastic and harmful environmental effects, and that when people are reminded of this perpetually, they develop a psychological mindfulness. That means that they will help the environment in many other ways. Let me show you this through logic first. Right now, there's incredible waste by people everywhere in their lives, not just in their household, not just with energy. People misuse water, they misuse food, etc. And people waste not because they don't care, but instead because they aren't thinking about it perpetually. And if we were to hypothetically have a policy that would get people to think every day that they need to conserve, every part of their lives needs to be conserving, then that mindset that they would habitually develop would carry over into other areas of their lives. We say that in terms of people's ecological mindfulness, the force of habit is a force of nature, and our plan can breed these habits. Our plan is a quota on household emissions. We think that because people will be thinking every day about plugging in every device, about every hour of air conditioning that they use, they will think, I've got to meet my quota, I've got to be mindful of the environment. And it's this immersion in conservationist thought, this perpetual engagement in environmental conservation inside their own home all the time, that will get people to think about conservation in many other places. Here's an example of how this exact logic works in real life. It's the example of recycling. Most people don't know this, but recycling is actually almost completely inconsequential in helping the environment. And it's because most countries actually separate their recycling and their trash at their own facilities anyway. And it's because, like, the average person will throw a banana into the recycling bin. And so the government needs to actually separate that trash on itself. So it doesn't actually help the environment. However, it is one of the most effective ways to reduce paper waste, to reduce the use of paper. And it's because people are immersed in an environment in which they're told that recycling is good, that you need to conserve. And so people think twice about wasting water. So they use less water when they turn on the shower. People run the tap for less long. And therefore, they use less waste. And we think that if we can prove that this is a legitimate policy, if we can prove that this is going to help the environment, which we have done, then it is incredibly important that we implement these quotas. Thank you.
I'd now like to call John to give his speech.
Thank you very much for your warm welcome. I would like to welcome you once again from Team Opposition. And before I move on to my own point, that we claim that we suppress groundbreaking innovation by letting the motion pass. I would like to rebut the speeches of the first and second speaker of proposition. First, the second speaker claimed in his introduction that every citizen wants to save the world. And we believe that even if this may be true for the majority of people living in a certain country, some just can't. And our first speaker has already nicely elaborated why this is a fact, because having to buy goods and highly efficient refrigerators, for example, costs you a hell amount of money which people cannot afford, which are in the situation. And so these people are tackled with imposing a quota, no thank you, and not the people which actually can do something about environment, and about the people which can actually reduce their energy consumption. And you're hitting the lower class of society, those who cannot afford, and so the motion cannot stand because of social inequality. No thank you. Secondly, you're claiming that people at the moment are wasteful. I don't think this is true, because at the moment we don't have a situation where energy is free, where gas and electricity are free. In many countries it is even really expensive, and you made the example of Germany as one of the top-notch states talking about doing something of environmental changes. Please.
50% of produced food is wasted. Address that.
No, I won't, because it doesn't have to do anything with emotion. I'm sorry. And you said that Germany was top-notch really in doing something about environmental change, and I believe that this is true. But even in Germany, we have really high prices on energy, and this is especially for the reason of changing our energy production to green energy. And so people already really have to look on their energy consumption, because if you consume more energy than you're supposed to do, it's going to get really expensive already. And this is why we believe that we already have a situation of households being really safeful with their energy consumption, because it harms their pockets already, the energy prices. And we believe that setting up such a quota will in the end just be another increase of energy prices, because no thank you, what will happen if you go over the limit? You can't just cut energy for a family with 3 children in a hard winter because they went over the limit with their, no thank you, with their cheap and non-efficient gas heater. You can't do that. And so what are you going to do? You're going to fine them by making the energy which comes after the imposed quota, by making this energy very expensive. And this is in the end just another raise on energy prices. And thirdly, you make quite some examples, and I would first like to get to the example of Moscow, where people would have to wear masks. I think you're cutting yourself on your own skin with this example, because your first speaker has mentioned that in Moscow, in Russia, the energy consumption of the economy is still very high, although they don't have a strong economy, and for that fact, the people have to wear face masks in Moscow. So this doesn't have anything to do with energy consumption in households. Secondly, there was an example, no thank you, of a big pollution where you couldn't see 10 meters in front of you in China. We know that this is reasoned by the traffic in China. And because the traffic system and the infrastructure isn't working in China's big cities, because there are too many people living in the cities, and this is a completely other issue than energy consumption of households. Yes, please.
Where did the emissions in Moscow come from? They come from power plants which provide energy for households, not from a bad economy.
And they may also come from the Russian economy. Isn't that true? Because Russia is also producing, and in the end, production is also hurting the climate. So this doesn't really have anything to do with consumption in the households. No, thank you. So let me get back to my claim I made, that we suppress groundbreaking innovation and harm society by introducing a limit on spending in households. And we think that groundbreaking innovations are always at first inefficient and wasteful. Let me give you two examples for this. Well, first we have the steam-powered locomotive, which has been a revolution and opened the door for a new age. However, it was not efficient at all and really wasteful. Another example, which may fit closer to the situation of households or computers, they've already also been a revolution, also with the innovations which came with computers, where we have the internet, for example. And they've also been really wasteful. We all know these pictures of the first computers which actually filled a full room, and they... Yes, please.
Well, of course, research and development institutions would have higher quotas, and so I don't see how this argument applies to households.
I will get to that. I will get to that later. To that actual point. So just wait a second for me to conclude this. So we think that this would have not have been possible with team proposition, because, and now listen to me closely, because this is where I'm going to reason your POI. The supply of goods and the research on goods increases with higher demand for the goods. And in case of team proposition, the innovations of the last decades would not have happened, because with the high inefficiency they had at the start, a society obeying to efficiency would not have created enough demand for the production to be profitable, and then for the product to develop over time to one of the most energy efficient product, and to one of the goods, talking about trains concerning infrastructure, talking about computers forming a revolution for a working life. And as the examples I made did, they would not have shaped our society to where we are right now. And for all these reasons, I beg you to oppose.
Thank you for your speech.
7:37.
Please welcome Milan, the third speaker of the proposition.
The very first opposition speaker stood up here and said that a government should be there to serve the people, and to be there for the people. Both sides can completely agree on this notion, but there's only one team in today's debate that actually helps the issue of climate change, that actually causes benefits for the people. Recall our burden in today's debate. We simply need to prove, in order to win, that this policy is in line with other governmental actions in order to solve citizens. In today's speech, I'm going to be asking three key questions. First, is a government justified in taking this action? Second, is this a societal problem or a problem of the individual? And finally, is a quota effective in meeting this end? But first, let's start with if a government is justified in taking this action. Now, the main contention that they bring up in opposition to this is that it's violating an individual's freedom. They say that essentially this discriminates against poorer people. But ultimately, recall our model. We tell you at the very beginning of this debate that there is a progressive tax base. We take into consideration the size of the household, what kind of income the household makes, and make it so that this is ultimately fair. Richer people are effectively taxed more when they hit this cap because they use more energy. Our model doesn't discriminate against poor people, it's there to help everyone effectively in society. But you don't think so.
But that would then mean that the people with a high income having 3 children and having his aunt and his grandmother living in the same household has to pay as much as just another person with a high income and just his wife living in the same household.
Again, we tell you at the very beginning of this debate, the first consideration is household size. So they wouldn't be paying the same amount. The cap would be varied and the tax would be varied. Therefore, this isn't violating individual rights for poorer people. But also, they bring up the point that this increases prices. We have a progressive model for this. But look to our analysis very carefully for this point. One of the burdens in this debate is whether a government is justified in taking this action. A government violates freedoms all the time if it's to benefit society as a whole. We place taxes on people and take their right to property and money in order to help society as a whole, in order to provide them with services. We're taking a much less severe action in this case because in order to help the environment of a society as a whole, a government needs to step in and take action. A person alone can't stop the tide of climate change. We need a government to step in and take action in order to benefit the whole of society. That's worth far more than violating a small right for a person.
Talking about the people's will that the government should serve this, don't you see that obviously it is not the people's will, that there are people who don't have the will to save the environment, and as you said that 50% of the food is wasted, obviously the people don't really care about that.
If a person doesn't care about the environment and they're actively harming society on the whole and actively harming the environment on the whole, it's the duty of a government to step in and help out. If a person's actively harming others in a society, the government is the actor that has to stop this. For example, a person can't simply harm someone else if they think they're justified in doing so, if it's their personal free choice. A government can limit your freedom in that case. You can't harm other people, that's what a government's job is. But our second question in today's debate is whether this is an individual decision or a societal decision. Now they bring up on their side that it's crucial for a person's self-actualization to carry out this task. And they state this will only be effective if an individual makes this decision on their own. But we give you concrete analysis in our third point. The only way for society to adopt this policy on a whole is if they do it together. For example, recycling didn't simply happen on its own. Individuals didn't go one by one and start recycling things. Only when governments made a huge push and put society in this position were people able to get on board with recycling. It's an idea that people do things together. Mindfulness develops as a society. Recycling doesn't even help out that much overall, but the very fact that people believe in it, the very fact that society is on board with it, is why people adopt this mentality. By that very same token, when we make people adopt this quota, when we force people into the idea of mindfulness, they'll begin expressing it in their everyday lives. They'll think about the energy they're wasting every time they plug in their computer or their television. This isn't a decision that an individual can make on their own. It's something that society needs to do all together in order to develop a concrete community of mindfulness. The individual can't tackle this on their own, and we're certainly not violating their self-actualization. But our third question in today's debate is whether this is ultimately effective or not. We've shown you in the past that quotas are the only way to quell the production of harmful emissions. We show you in the past with the Kyoto Protocol. Because they set quotas on certain things, on carbon emissions, they were able to stop more emissions than all other environmental policies put together in the past. And the reason behind this is simple. When you set a quota on demand, and you stop the demand of the people, obviously the supply will be reduced. The production of emissions that are harmful will be reduced. This benefit is unique to quotas, and only the proposition team brings this to the table. Their third point is all about how this reduces innovations in households, but ultimately, these big innovations weren't started in households.
Don't you think that it's crucial to be efficient, that the people have to stand behind this idea, and that there are a lot of people who are not standing behind this idea?
Again, the way you get people to stand behind this idea is to implement it in the first place.
The only reason people got behind recycling is because it was implemented and then everyone got on board with the idea of mindfulness and with the idea of conserving paper and other recyclable goods. People won't simply get on board unless we make that first societal push for that benefit. But like I was saying, their entire third argument is predicated on the point that we're suppressing industry. But essentially these huge innovations, Apple and other technology companies, didn't start in a household. They weren't built in a basement. So when we cap technology production, when we cap energy, we're not really harming innovation. So their entire third point is baseless. Look to the many examples we've given you. We cited Moscow, and the refutation for that was simply that a bad economy led to people having to wear masks. This doesn't make any sense. The reason people wear masks in Moscow is because households pollute the environment so much. And remember, this isn't caused by industry. Only 40% of Russia's economy is accounted for in industry. These horrible emissions are coming from households. The reason we need to place quotas on households is in order to reduce these emissions. Quotas reduce the demand and thereby reduce the production of these harmful emissions. But ultimately, let's take a grand overview of today's debate. What Team Proposition needed to prove to you today is that this is in line with other government actions in order to serve the people. We show you in today's round that governments take actions all the time that limit the freedom of the people so long as it's for societal good. We meet our burden because we show you that the environment is in great danger. And if you simply don't care about it, like side opposition provides you with, that's something that a government needs to step in and stop. We meet the first part of our burden because governments do this all the time, and it's certainly necessary when we look to the careless mindset that side opposition is proposing when dealing with the environment. But we meet the second part of our burden, that this is effective in serving the people, because quotas have proven to be the best method in the past. We show you the Kyoto Protocol, and we show you the idea that demand is the only way to cut harmful emissions. So ultimately, we meet our burden in today's round, and that's why Team Proposition ultimately should come out on top. But remember, because we believe that clean air and clean water are just as important as bridges and roads, we strongly urge a proposition vote. Thank you.
Thank you for your speech. Please welcome Julian, the third speaker of the
If that proposition can prove to us that this policy will be efficient, we are ready to concede that this policy would also be legitimate. And this is something we will do because we will have to concentrate on the legitimacy, on the efficiency. So I will talk about two things in my speech. First of all, about the efficiency in the short term and in the long term, and then secondly, about whether or not this will actually raise sensibility for environmental problems among the people. So will this be efficient? So that proposition told us that in the short term, people nowadays have to wear gas masks in cities and so on. They are like severely harmed by this. And the mechanisms they told us was that we will solve this under their model because if less energy gets consumed in big cities, then less energy will obviously be consumed in the city and therefore also produced in the city. And we concede that this would probably work if this was actually the case. But we see that there are other mechanisms that actually work against this. Namely, that what our second speaker mentioned, that we would that more energy-saving devices would be innovated, and people, because they want to save energy, will buy those devices, and therefore they will increase production. And because production is also harmful for the environment, this will, in the end, not change the amount of energy that actually gets consumed. And we can see this because, for example, it is known that buying an old timer can also be better for the environment, because the production of a new car is extremely harmful for the environment. Now, side propositions tell us no, this will not be the case, because people will care more about how much energy they will use, and therefore they will act more efficient and not buy new things that are more efficient. And we do not think that this is actually the reality. We think that people will still prefer having a warm home. They will still prefer having a bright home, and we see that they will still prefer to buy something that makes them able to have that, instead of losing those benefits that are key for their everyday life. And therefore, we see that that energy demand would not actually get lower. And we see that because the government would obviously produce the energy like in the power plants that already exist, and not like build new ones like outside of the city. The energy would obviously also get produced in the city, and like under their example, for example in Russia, there would still be this environmental harm in the city. So we think that in the short term we would not have this benefit. So to come to the long term, so we see in the long term we had no proof by such proposition that by enabling this policy will actually prevent reaching the amount of climate change that is a tangible harm for the environment. And therefore we see that this will only delay the problem but not actually solve this. And the reason why this will be the case is because it's obvious it will be impossible to make the quotas so little that they can so that the energy that gets saved is effective enough to actually save the environment. Yes?
We believe that we are taking a first step towards solving the problem. But even if we are delaying it, isn't delaying a problem a good thing?
I will tell you why this is not a good thing, but well, we do not think that like just this step to the right direction is actually like a tangible benefit, because we think that like, if actually delaying it is harmful, then we see that this doesn't make sense. So we see that because we wouldn't be able to like make the quota so little that people wouldn't have light anymore, or people wouldn't have a warm home anymore. We cannot make the quota so little that they actually solve the problem. So why is delaying not a tangible benefit? So we see that, first of all, even if delaying is a benefit, we would see that the harms that opposition mentioned overrule those benefits. First of all, because we would restrict individual freedom, we would see that this would not only affect like how long the person can use their AC, it will also affect like what computers they use, how warm their home is, like how bright their home is, and even though those things are little, like we see that in the mass this will still be a tangible harm. Therefore, we see that delaying the problem, as long as that proposition doesn't explain to us why delaying the problem would be that beneficial, we see that the harms are more important. We secondly see this harm of lack of innovation, and this is what I want to explain one more time, since that proposition doesn't seem to have got that. First of all, we see that groundbreaking things aren't going to be innovated, and that proposition told us, well, those research like laboratories would obviously have higher quotas. But this would not be the problem. The problem would be that a household wouldn't buy stuff that is energy consuming and not something they immediately need. So, for example, to show this why this is important, for example, it would mean that historically the computer would not have been invented, because for a company it doesn't make sense to produce something that is very energy consuming and not yet of use for the person. So it means that the computer would never have been invented, and we believe that this would be a huge harm, for example, because even like revolutions are sometimes caused by such things as the internet. Yes, please.
Sir, nobody bought the first computer. Those things are developed for research purposes so that they can be later lucrative.
Yeah, but like even if they are like first made for research, it would mean that to make this research beneficial in the long term, it would mean that you would have to make this for the market and sell this to the people. But so therefore we would have some time where the people would have to buy the first computer, and this is only possible if they can do this without risking their lights going off and that stuff. And therefore we think that this will still be the case. So what we can and the next argument, like which is just a minor issue here, as we believe, is the sensibility point. Like that proposition told us that the people would be more sensible about this. Well, we do not think that this will be the case. First of all, because this border, which is the quota, is very generic. The government like just implements it and it says that this would save the environment. What we can basically see is that in the short term, the environment would obviously not be solved. So what people would think is that without reason they would have to save energy, and this is why we believe that actually people would even be against saving the environment in the long term, because they will see that saving the environment means that you have to switch your light off, that saving the environment means that you have to live in a cold home, and this is why people would not. This would not be the case, and this is why the motion has to fall.
My pleasure to ask Julia to give the opposition's replies.
Ladies and gentlemen, we've heard some benefits and harms during this debate supporting whether it is justified or not to introduce the model that Team Proposition has presented. And I want to start this reply speech by looking at these benefits and harms that have been presented during this debate. Well, we as Team Opposition presented you that harms like taking the individual freedom or discriminating of poorer people. And then side Proposition came up and said, well, we have to do something against the climate change and we have to make a start doing this. So even if we see that there are benefits and this could be supporting their side and that it can be justified, that we have to say, well, we have to do something to stop this climate change, we still have to ask us the question if introducing their model is actually efficient in achieving this goal. So if we look at the efficiency, Team Proposition told us that people are not really aware of the fact how much energy they use or how much they pollute the environment. But we see that this is not true. Well, if they say that 50% of the food is wasted, why is it wasted? People know exactly that it's bad to throw away food, and people know exactly that it's bad to have a big car or to use a lot of energy. But people obviously have a different prioritization than team proposition things, because we see that people know exactly that certain things are bad, but still they don't want to give up their lifestyle that they have. They don't want to give up that lifestyle that they have in this modern world, where having computers, using mobile phones and all these electronic things is simply part of their lives. And so we see that there are obviously a lot of people not really standing behind this whole idea of doing more for the environment, or they would like to do more for the environment, but simply their lifestyle is more important for them than saving the environment. And we see that if a state is there to serve the people's will, they should also think about what is actually the people's will, and is now imposing this quota actually what the people want, and can it therefore actually be efficient if the people are not yet maybe standing behind this idea. And we see that eventually an idea without people standing behind it cannot be efficient in the long term. And because it takes so much more and it also takes so much more to save the environment than simply reducing the amount of energy used in the households. So we see that this can actually also be a step backwards and not forward to this spirit of some people who actually want to save the environment, or those people who are neutral to this idea that we presented to you in the first speech. And there could also be people turning against this whole idea because it can also, imposing and being forced to do something can also mean that people can turn against this whole idea simply because it's imposed, and simply because there is the state telling them what to do. And also this whole talking of, oh, we need to save energy and we need to do this and we need to do that can get on the nerves of the people, and that's why people could even turn against this idea and turning against becoming more aware, and that would mean that that this is not efficient in the long term, and that by imposing this quota we would achieve the exact opposite of what was actually the idea of this, and that we have in the long term not more people supporting the green, all this saving of the environment, but people turning against this idea, and this whole model cannot be efficient if we don't have people standing behind it. And for all of these reasons, I beg you to oppose.
It's now my pleasure to ask Nikki to finish this debate and give the proposition's reply speech.
A government can't just stand idly by when its people's rights are not being protected. A government can't just watch its citizens walk down the street with gas masks on. A government can't just watch videos of its citizens lighting their tap water on fire because natural gas has seeped into their water lines. A government cannot simply allow public goods and the public will to be ignored because it's hard to solve those problems. because we on Team Proposition believe that clean water and clean air are just as important as roads and bridges. It is an honor to propose this motion. In this speech, I'll be doing two things. First, I'll begin by clearing up some of the framing for this round, and second of all, I'll offer you a comparison between the worlds of Team Proposition and the world of Team Opposition. But let's begin by clarifying a few things. First of all, the burden within this round has been very much conceded by Team Opposition. They have agreed that the idea of a quota is well within the bounds of what a government can do to protect the people, which means the only question worth answering left is whether this is in any way helping the people. Not about how much, not about whether it solves climate change, but does this benefit the people? That's how you must decide this round. But second of all, we need to talk about the model, because Team Opposition is arguing against the model they wished we had, not the model we actually have. They're arguing against a model where the same cap is put on anyone, where the cap is so low that poor people can't heat their house, and where people can't meet their basic needs. That's not the model that's being presented by Team Proposition. We're presenting a model that is progressive, that sets the cap high enough that people can meet their goals, but that still lowers energy consumption. The fact of the matter is that rich households use far more energy than poor households. There's no reason why we would go after those who do not contribute in a large way to emissions in order to solve the problem. This argument doesn't make sense. Just don't consider it within this round. But then let's move on to examine the two different visions of the world you have been presented. On Team Proposition, you have a world where we are reducing the demand for energy and by proxy reducing the amount of harmful emissions. Team Opposition completely conceded that. In their own words, they agreed that that would probably happen in their third speech. At that point, Team Proposition is showing you that the government is helping the people. That should be enough to decide this round. But on Team Opposition, you see a world where they are devoted to protecting people who don't care, to saying that you have a legal right not to participate for the public good. If individual freedom was all that mattered, why would anything be illegal? Why would we step in to stop people from harming each other? In much the same way that none of you could shoot me, none of you should be able to pollute the air and water that all of us rely on to survive. The government must step in to protect the public good, and that's something that Team Opposition doesn't understand. The world of Team Proposition is one where people don't buy computers the size of rooms. We don't see why that's a problem. Innovation has never been driven by households. Innovation is driven by industry. And once it becomes efficient and cheap, it moves into the household. This argument about innovation is the same no matter which world you believe in. But the world of the opposition is one where nothing is done. One where just because we can't solve climate change, we are unwilling to fight climate change. Now, they ask you to decide this round because we don't solve climate change. And they're right. The fact of the matter is, we don't know how to solve climate change. Do any of you? Do they? No one knows how to solve the problems of the environment. But we do know how to fight those problems. How to make the world, for the people of the government, a slightly better place. Because we on Team Proposition are willing to fight to make the environment better, even though we can't make it perfect. It is such an honor to propose today's motion. Thank you.